Hello everyone, how are you? If you are here, it means that you have already seen the videos that Professor Natalia has prepared for rounding off some of the topics that were dealt within Unit 1. So now we are going to show you a model analysis of a pair of two sentences that are part of your handbook. Within the section on postponement, extraposition, you have a practice that requires you or that asks you to translate, to provide the translations into either English or Spanish, and then produce your own contrastive analysis. In this case, we're going to focus on sentence number 3, encuentro difícil convencerlo, which belongs to page 49. So, for encuentro difícil convencerlo, the rendition we have produced is I find it difficult to persuade him. When analyzing or when you are asked to analyze these sentences, we expect to find, or we want you to analyze the syntax and the semantics, that is to say, argument structure in this case, and also to speak about correspondence or non-correspondence between the languages. So, let's see. Let's start. As regards syntax, in Spanish, we can identify the sujeto desinencial yo based on the verbal inflection of the transitive verb encontrar. The direct object convencerlo, realized by means of a non-finite clause or oración no conjugada de infinitivo, and the complemento predicativo objetivo obligatorio difícil, realized by means of an adjective. In English, on the other hand, we can identify the complex transitive verb find, the subject I canonically realized by means of a nominal in the form of the personal pronoun, the direct object to persuade him realized by means of a to infinitive clause, and the object complement difficult realized by means of an adjective. So, as you can see, we have analyzed the syntax in both languages. We have identified the constituents that make up the sentence, which is the function of each constituent, if it is a subject, a direct object, what type of verb, transitive, intransitive, complex transitive. And we have also classified the type of structure that each of the elements belongs to. So, if we speak of convencerlo, for example, we will say that the function is direct object and that convencerlo, which is a direct object, is realized by means of a non-finite clause. So, there are several aspects to take into account when analyzing the syntax. It here, this it, functions as anticipatory it. In this example, the expletive pronoun it, which is devoid of meaning and serves only a grammatical function, signals the extraposition of the direct object towards the end of the sentence. In this case, we can hypothesize that the movement of the direct object can be accounted for by its abiding by of the principle of end weight, taking into account the complexity of this direct object or of this element. So, when you have to make reference to the presence of it or the presence of there, in this case, classifying the it as an anticipatory it is correct, but this is the traditional classification. We expect you to speak of or to develop this notion of expletive pronoun. In this case, we have to also explain or give reasons as to which might be the reasons for having the direct object in a position which is not the canonical position of the element. In this case, we can then speak of the principle of end weight, taking into account that the direct object in this example is realized by means of a clause, a to infinitive clause, and not by means of, for example, a noun phrase. A to infinitive clause is a more complex and longer constituent. So when we have constituents that are more complex, by following the principle of end weight, these constituents tend to be towards the end of the sentence. In this example, we can refer to extraposition of a clausal object following the terminology presented by Riemann and Quirk, 1990. We can also speak of extraposition of an internal complement, as per Huddleston and Palem, 2005. This is the authors that Professor Natalia tackled in the rounding off presentation. As regards argument structure, in Spanish, the verb encontrar selects for two arguments and a secondary predicate. In this usage, in the usage of encontrar o encuentro difícil convencerlo, the verb encontrar selects for these two arguments, and in this usage we can classify the verb encontrar as verbo de entendimiento, as per Di Tullio 2010. This terminology is within the chapter on funciones sintácticas del sintagma verbal, in which, or under the section on predicativos, predicados secundarios. The verb is the predicate functioning as predicator, which selects for two arguments. That is to say, yo, which is can be classified as patient or experiencer in terms of a thematic role, and convencerlo as a theme. And also, this verbal predicate selects for a secondary predicate, which is difficult. In this case, you have to have in mind that this is not just encontrar algo, but rather encontrar as synonymous for consider something as something else. Considering the number of arguments selected, this is a predicado diádico. But it is important to highlight that it also selects for another predicate. As Professor Natalia expanded on her video, this selection of the secondary predicate is required by the verb encontrar in order to convey this meaning of considering something as something else. In English, we can identify the verbal predicate find, which we have already classified as complex transitive verb, functioning as predicator and selecting for two arguments and a secondary predicate as well. I, with the theta role of patient or experiencer, and to persuade him as theme, in addition to difficult. Considering the number of arguments selected, this is a two-place predicate, and it also selects for a secondary predicate. In both languages, difícil and difficult are secondary predications or secondary predicates required by the meaning of the main predicate, encontrar or find. If we expand the sentences, as in encuentro que convencerlo es difícil, and I find that it is difficult to persuade him, we can argue that difficult and difícil are the non-verbal predicates acting as predicators in the subordinate nominal clauses that function as direct object in the respective versions. This is an instance of non-correspondence as regards syntax, since in English we can see the presence of an expletive, traditionally called anticipatory it in this case, which is anticipating the direct object that is extraposed, whereas in Spanish there is not such expletive pronoun. As English is a non-prodrop language, it requires the presence of an expletive that fills in the canonical position of the direct object, which is immediately after the transitive verb. As regards semantics, this is an instance of correspondence, since the predicate functioning as predicator is a verbal one that we have identified as encontrar and find, selecting both two arguments and a secondary predicate. So, this model analysis and the ones that Professor Natalia has produced are useful for you to produce your own paragraphs. You were assigned some homework that you have to hand in, so please capitalize on the information we have provided on these videos. And again, in case you have questions and you have doubts, you can always go back to the classroom, the Google Classroom groups to post there your questions and debate with your partners. And if the doubt is still present and the student helpers, after debating with them, you cannot reach a conclusion or find an answer, you can always post your doubts on the specific forum. Thank you very much, and we keep on working.